January 17, 1945. A temporary holding facility outside Aachen, Germany, 3047 p.m. The winter light fell weak and colorless through the shattered windows of what had once been a municipal building. Frost clung to the interior walls. In the corner of a makeshift interrogation room, Oberleutnant Margaret Hoffmann sat with her hands folded in her lap, her uniform still bearing the insignia of the Nachrichtenhelferin, communications auxiliary of the Wehrmacht. She had been captured 3 days prior during the collapse of German positions along the Ruhr River. Her face, pale and drawn from sleeplessness, maintained the disciplined composure expected of someone who had served the Reich since 1941. But when the door opened and 2 American soldiers entered, both women, both in full United States Army uniform, something inside Margaret Hoffmann fractured. Her lips trembled, her eyes, which had remained dry through interrogation by male officers, through the humiliation of surrender, through the sight of her country burning, suddenly filled with tears. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking, her carefully maintained facade crumbling not from defeat but from profound cognitive dissonance. What Margaret Hoffmann witnessed in that moment was not merely 2 enemy soldiers. It was the collision of 2 irreconcilable philosophies made flesh. It was the visible proof that everything she had been taught about the natural order, about the role of women, about the supposed degeneracy of American society had been a lie. The women who stood before her wore trousers. They carried sidearms. They spoke with authority. They represented a nation that had armed its women not out of desperation, as Germany had done in its final throes, but out of principle, out of a belief in capability, divorced from biology, out of a doctrine that valued contribution over gender. And in that frigid room in Aachen, as the winter sun cast long shadows across the rubble of the Third Reich, Margaret Hoffmann understood with terrible clarity that she had served the wrong side of history. The story of women in the Second World War has been told many times, but rarely from this angle, from the perspective of those who witnessed their ideological opposite and found themselves unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had believed. The encounters between German female auxiliaries and American servicewomen were not frequent, but when they occurred, they produced a psychological zui that transcended the mere fact of military defeat. These were moments of profound ideological confrontation, where theory met reality, where propaganda met truth, where the carefully constructed mythology of National Socialist gender roles collided with the pragmatic egalitarianism of American democracy. To understand why these encounters had such devastating emotional impact, one must first understand the radically different philosophies that shaped women's roles in Germany and America during the war years. In the Third Reich, women existed within a carefully circumscribed ideological framework summarized by the slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. The Nazi ideology, articulated by Hitler himself in countless speeches and codified in the policies of the regime, held that women's primary function was biological, to bear and raise children for the fatherland, to maintain the home as a sanctuary of Germanic values, to support their men but never to compete with them. When the regime did mobilize women for war work, it did so reluctantly and out of dire necessity. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Luftwaffenhelferinnen, the various female auxiliaries that served the Wehrmacht were always framed as temporary measures, as sacrifices necessitated by the emergency of total war, never as evidence that women could or should perform military functions. Even as German women operated anti-aircraft guns in the defense of Berlin, even as they served in combat zones as radio operators, administrative staff, the official line remained unchanged. This was aberration, not evolution, not pholution, necessity, not philosophy. The women who served in these roles were subjected to intensive ideological indoctrination. Margaret Hoffmann, like thousands of her contemporaries, had joined the Nachrichtenhelferin in 1941 at age 19, motivated by a combination of patriotic fervor and genuine belief in the cause. Her training emphasized not just technical proficiency in communications equipment, but also racial ideology and gender theory. She attended lectures on the degeneracy of enemy societies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, where women supposedly abandoned their natural roles, where gender lines blurred, where the corruption of proper social order led inevitably to moral and military weakness. She was taught that American women who worked in factories or served in auxiliary roles did so because American men were too soft, too corrupted by democracy and materialism to properly defend their nation. She was taught that this reversal of natural gender hierarchy was both symptom and cause of American cultural decay. She was taught that while German women made temporary sacrifices for the fatherland, they did so while maintaining their essential femininity, their dedication to future motherhood, their subordination to male authority. The American embrace of women in military roles, she was told, represented the desperate flailing of a civilization in terminal decline. Across the Atlantic, a different philosophy was taking shape, one born not from ideology, but from pragmatism and principle. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the military leadership faced an immediate problem. The massive expansion of the armed forces would require administrative, technical, and logistical support on a scale never before attempted. The solution was not ideological, but practical. In May 1942, Congress authorized the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which became the Women's Army Corps in 1943. Over the course of the war, more than 150,000 women would serve in the WWII, performing 239 different jobs. Everything from aircraft mechanics to cryptographers, from telephone operators to intelligence analysts. The women accepted for volunteer emergency service, the Navy's equivalent program, enlisted nearly 100,000 women. The Marine Corps Women's Reserve added another 23,000. The Army and Navy Nurse Corps together deployed over 70,000 women to combat theaters worldwide. These were not auxiliaries in the German sense, women performing support roles while carefully maintaining their status as non-combatants. These were enlisted soldiers, sailors, and Marines. They took the same oath as their male counterparts. They wore uniforms of the same design and quality. They received military rank and commanded subordinates. They were subject to military discipline and military law. The distinction was profound. The United States had not simply mobilized women for war work. It had integrated them into the military structure itself, granting them status, authority, and recognition as full members of the armed forces. This was not presented as a temporary emergency measure to be reversed at war's end, but as an expansion of opportunity, a recognition that citizenship carried with it both rights and responsibilities that transcended gender. The American approach was not without its contradictions and limitations. Women in the military faced discrimination, harassment, and skepticism from male colleagues and commanders. They were barred from direct combat roles. Their contributions were often minimized in official accounts and public memory, but the fundamental principle was different from the Nazi framework. American military policy held that women could and should serve, that their service was valuable not just as a stopgap measure, but as a permanent expansion of the national defense capability. That capability, rather than biology, should determine assignment. The women who enlisted did so under the same motivations as their male counterparts: patriotism, adventure, economic opportunity, desire to contribute to the war effort. They were not framed as making a sacrifice of their femininity, but as exercising their rights as citizens. The propaganda posters that recruited them showed confident, capable women in uniform with slogans like "Release a man for combat" and "Are you a girl with a star-spangled heart?" The message was clear. Service was not a corruption of womanhood, but an expression of it. This philosophical divide between service as aberration versus service as right, between mobilization from desperation versus mobilization from principle, might have remained abstract, a matter for historians and political theorists to debate, had the war not brought these two systems into direct contact. As Allied forces pushed into German territory in late 1944 and early 1945, encounters between American servicewomen and German female auxiliaries became increasingly common. The Americans came as translators, as intelligence officers, as administrative staff for the occupation authorities, as nurses treating wounded Germans in field hospitals. They came in uniform, with rank insignia, with authority. They came representing a system that had not merely utilized women's labor, but had acknowledged their competence and granted them status. And when German women, particularly those who had served the Reich, who had internalized its ideology, who had believed in its vision of gender and society, encountered them, the psychological impact was devastating. The historical record preserves fragmentary but telling accounts of these encounters. In February 1945, at a processing center for captured Wehrmacht personnel near Liège, Belgium, A group of Luftwaffenhelferinnen women who had operated searchlights and ranging equipment for anti-aircraft batteries were interviewed by Lieutenant Sarah Markowitz of the Women's Army Corps, a Yiddish-speaking American whose family had emigrated from Poland in 1925. The German women, aged between 18 and 23, had been captured when their position was overrun by American forces. They had expected male interrogators, perhaps rough treatment. Instead, they found themselves facing a woman in American uniform who spoke fluent German, who conducted the interview with professional courtesy, who possessed clear authority over the male soldiers who escorted them. One of the German women, a 19-year-old named Helga Schneider, asked Lieutenant Markowitz directly, "How can you wear that uniform? How can you give orders to men?" Markowitz's response, recorded in her post-war memoir, was simple: "The same way you operated your searchlight. Someone needed to do the job. I was capable, so I did it." That exchange captures the essential asymmetry of these encounters. For the American women, their military service was straightforward. They had skills. The military needed those skills. They enlisted. There was no existential crisis in wearing the uniform, no sense of violating natural law. For the German women, particularly those who had absorbed years of Nazi ideological training, the sight of American servicewomen produced cognitive dissonance bordering on psychological collapse. Everything they had been taught about the weakness of American society, about the degeneracy of democracy, about the natural subordination of women, was contradicted by the evidence before their eyes. These were not the desperate, unwomanly creatures of Nazi propaganda. They were professional, competent, confident. They represented a system that had defeated the Reich not despite its inclusion of women in military roles, but partially because it could draw on the full capabilities of its population because it valued contribution over ideology, because its social organization was flexible rather than rigid. In March 1945, at a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt, Captain Helen Brewster of the Army Nurse Corps found herself treating German civilian casualties alongside captured Sanitätshelfer and medical auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht. The German nurses, though technically prisoners, were pressed into service because of the overwhelming number of casualties. For 3 days, Captain Brewster and her German counterparts worked side by side, performing the same medical functions, facing the same horrific injuries. But the German women were not enlisted soldiers. They were auxiliaries, lacking military rank or status. When Captain Brewster gave orders, they followed them, not because she was the enemy, but because she possessed rank authority that they did not. One of the German nurses, a woman named Elisabeth Kruger, who had served since 1942, broke down during a rare moment of rest. "We do the same work," she said to Captain Brewster through a translator. "We face the same dangers. But you are an officer. You have rank, you have status. We are nothing. We are auxiliaries. We are helpers, not soldiers, not even really women anymore, because we have left our proper place. But not soldiers either. We are nothing." That sense of existential void of having sacrificed the traditional role of women without gaining the recognition or status of soldiers haunted many German female auxiliaries when confronted with their American counterparts. They had been told that their service was temporary, that after the war they would return to their proper roles as wives and mothers, that their contributions were valuable precisely because they were sacrifices of their natural femininity for the emergency of war. But the American women wore their uniforms without apology or ambiguity. They had not sacrificed their femininity. They had expanded it. They had not stepped outside their proper role. They had redefined what that role could include. They represented a philosophical framework that German women had been taught was impossible, degenerate, doomed to failure. Yet here they were, victorious, confident, professional, feminine in their own terms rather than in terms dictated by ideology. The emotional impact of these encounters was heightened by the material circumstances. By early 1945, Germany was in a state of comprehensive collapse. Cities were rubble. The food supply system had broken down. Millions of refugees fled westward ahead of the Soviet advance. The women who had served the Reich often found themselves in desperate circumstances, homeless, separated from family, facing an uncertain future in a defeated nation. When they encountered American servicewomen, they saw not just ideological opposites but material abundance. The American uniforms were well made, standardized, properly sized. The American women ate rations that would have seemed luxurious in late-war Germany: canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee. They drove vehicles, operated sophisticated equipment, had access to medical care and supplies. The contrast was not just philosophical but visceral. The Americans represented a society that could afford to clothe, feed, equip, and pay its women soldiers, a society whose productive capacity was so vast that it could wage global war while maintaining living standards higher than Germany achieved even in peacetime. This material contrast had profound psychological implications. German women had been taught that their sacrifices, the hunger, the privation, the dangers of war service were necessary, that everyone in the Reich suffered together, that their deprivation was matched by equal sacrifice from all citizens. But the American servicewomen they encountered were not starving. They were not dressed in improvised uniforms. They were not desperate. They represented a system that had defeated the Reich not through greater sacrifice but through greater productivity, not through more intense mobilization but through more effective organization, not through ideological purity but through pragmatic inclusion. The message was unmistakable: the American way, the democratic, capitalist, pluralistic American way that Nazi ideology had declared degenerate and doomed, worked better. It produced more wealth, more stability, more opportunity, and it did so while granting women a status and recognition that the Reich, for all its totalitarian control, had never conceded. The recurring symbol in these encounters, appearing again and again in memoirs and historical accounts, was the American woman's uniform itself, specifically the trousers. In Nazi Germany, women in trousers were associated with degeneracy, with the breakdown of gender distinctions, with the cultural Bolshevism that the regime claimed to oppose. German female auxiliaries wore skirts or dresses, maintaining the visual distinction between male and female even in quasi-military contexts. But American servicewomen wore trousers as part of their standard uniform. This was not a concession to field conditions or a temporary measure. It was policy. The trousers were tailored, properly fitted, part of a complete uniform ensemble that included shirt, jacket, cap, insignia of rank. When German women saw these uniforms, they saw the physical manifestation of a different social contract, one in which women could dress for function rather than ideology or practical considerations outweighed gender symbolism, where the uniform itself declared that the wearer was a soldier first and a woman second, or more accurately, that being a soldier and being a woman were not mutually exclusive categories. Greta Hoffmann, a staff chauffeur and a staff auxiliary who served in the Wehrmacht headquarters staff, was processed through an American facility in April 1945. In her post-war testimony, recorded in 1947, she described her reaction to the American women officers who handled her case. "I could not stop staring at their trousers. I know it sounds foolish, but that is what affected me most. Not the defeat, not the surrender, not even the kindness they showed us, which was unexpected. It was the trousers. They wore them so naturally, so comfortably, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for a woman to dress like that, to stand like that, to command like that. And I realized that for them, it was normal. There was no contradiction. They were not pretending to be men. They were not performing some emergency role they would shed at war's end. They were simply soldiers." And I thought of all the years I spent in skirts and dresses, maintaining that distinction, even when it was impractical, even when it made the work harder, because we were told it mattered, that it preserved something essential. And here were these Americans in their trousers, and they had won the war, and they looked neither masculine nor unwomanly. They looked capable, professional, and I wept because I understood then that we had lost more than a war. We had lost years of our lives to a lie. The lie that Greta Hoffmann referenced was the fundamental Nazi claim that rigid gender hierarchy was natural, inevitable, and necessary for social stability. The evidence of American servicewomen demolished that claim. Here was a society that had granted women military status, that had allowed them to wear practical clothing, that had given them authority over men, that had paid them and promoted them and treated them as full members of the armed forces, and that society had not collapsed into degeneracy and chaos. It had instead produced the most powerful military force in human history, had achieved industrial productivity that dwarfed all other nations, had maintained democratic governance under wartime. Stress had preserved civil liberties even while mobilizing for total war. The American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, worked well, treating women as citizens rather than as breeders, as individuals with capabilities rather than as embodiments of biological destiny. The encounters between German and American women soldiers also revealed the different relationships these women had with their respective militaries and governments. American servicewomen, despite facing discrimination and limited opportunities, generally described their military service in positive terms as a period of growth, of expanded horizons, of contribution to a meaningful cause. They had volunteered. They could resign or refuse re-enlistment. They were paid according to rank. They accrued benefits, including educational support under the GI Bill after the war. Their relationship with the military was contractual, bounded, defined by mutual obligation. German female auxiliaries, by contrast, had a relationship of total subordination. They were mobilized, not recruited. Their service was presented as duty to the Volk, not as contractual employment. They received minimal compensation, no benefits, no promise of post-war support. They existed in a liminal space, neither civilian nor soldier, neither autonomous nor fully subordinate, useful for their labor but denied the recognition and status that labor warranted. This difference became painfully apparent in the final months of the war, when the Reich's collapse left female auxiliaries in desperate straits. The military infrastructure that had employed them disintegrated. They received no demobilization support, no assistance in returning home, no recognition of their service. They were simply abandoned. American servicewomen who encountered these desperate women often found themselves providing not just logistical support but basic humanitarian assistance, food, shelter, medical care. The irony was not lost on the German women. The enemy was treating them better than their own government had. This realization that the Americans, whom they had been taught to hate and fear, showed more concern for their welfare than the Reich they had served completed the psychological devastation. It was not just that their side had lost the war, or that their ideology had been proven wrong, but that their sacrifice had been meaningless, that the system they had served had viewed them as disposable assets rather than as valued members of a national community. In the displaced persons camps that dotted occupied Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, these themes played out repeatedly. American servicewomen, administrators, translators, nurses, logistics officers worked daily with German women attempting to rebuild their lives in the ruins. The Americans represented stability, authority, resources. They distributed food, processed paperwork, made decisions about housing and employment. They did so in uniform, with rank authority, with the backing of military structure. For German women who had internalized Nazi ideology about female roles, this daily contact with American servicewomen was a continuous education in an alternative social model. They saw women giving orders to men. They saw women driving trucks, operating radios, managing complex administrative systems. They saw women treated with professional respect by their male colleagues. They saw women who combined competence with femininity, who wore lipstick with their uniforms, who maintained personal relationships while fulfilling military duties, who rejected the false choice between being a woman and being a professional. The psychological literature on cognitive dissonance helps explain the intensity of emotional reactions these encounters produce. When deeply held beliefs are confronted with contradictory evidence, individuals experience profound psychological discomfort. They can respond by rejecting the evidence, by modifying their beliefs, or by experiencing emotional breakdown. For many German female auxiliaries, rejection was impossible. The evidence was too immediate, too overwhelming. The Americans were there in uniform, victorious, professional, undeniably real. Belief modification required acknowledging that years of ideology, training, and service had been founded on lies that the Reich had deceived them about the nature of gender, society, and their own potential. Many found themselves unable to integrate these realizations without emotional collapse. Hence the weeping, the breakdowns, the expressions of utter disorientation that appear throughout the historical record. Lieutenant Colonel Anna Wilson, who commanded a Wept detachment responsible for processing German prisoners and displaced persons in Bavaria during the summer of 1945, described these encounters in her official reports and personal correspondence. The German women we deal with seem more psychologically shattered than the men. The men have lost a war, which is comprehensible to them. They fought, they lost. That is the nature of war. But the women have lost something more fundamental: their understanding of the world. They look at us in our uniforms, and you can see the mental struggle on their faces. Some refuse to accept that we are real soldiers. They insist we must be some kind of civilian volunteers, that our uniforms must be costumes. Others become desperately curious, asking question after question about our service, our training, our authority. Still others simply shut down, as if the cognitive load of reconciling what they see with what they believe is too great to bear. I have seen German women weep at the sight of me in my uniform more times than I can count. Not because they fear me, not because of anything I have said or done, but simply because I exist, because my existence contradicts everything they were taught to believe. The historical documentation of these encounters is fragmentary, scattered across memoirs, official reports, letters, and oral histories. The U.S. Army did not systematically study the psychological impact of American servicewomen on German prisoners and civilians. The focus of occupation authorities was on denazification, demilitarization, and reconstruction, not on the subtle ways that American gender norms challenged German ideology. But the traces are there for historians willing to look. In the records of displaced persons camps, in the after-action reports of WWII detachments, in the personal papers of American women who served in occupied Germany, in the oral histories collected from German women decades after the war, when they could finally articulate experiences that had been too painful or too confusing to express at the time. One particularly telling account comes from a group interview conducted in 1947 with former Nachrichtenhelferinnen who had served in France and been captured by American forces in August 1944. These women spent nearly a year in American custody before being repatriated to Germany. During that time, they had extensive contact with American servicewomen who staffed the detention facilities. The interviewer, an American military psychologist named Dr. Rebecca Goldman, asked them what had most surprised them about their captivity. The unanimous answer was not the living conditions or the treatment by guards, but the American women soldiers. One respondent, identified only as Respondent C, age 22, stated, "We thought we understood Americans from the propaganda films and lectures. We expected them to be crude, materialistic, lacking in culture and discipline. The women, we were told, were especially degenerate, mannish, aggressive, unfeminine." But the reality was completely different. The American women we met were professional, educated, capable. They treated us firmly but fairly. They did their jobs with competence. And they were not unfeminine at all. They wore makeup. They talked about their families, their boyfriends, their plans after the war. They were women, fully women, but they were also soldiers. We had been taught this was impossible, that you could be one or the other, but not both. But they proved it was possible, and that realization was more devastating than the defeat because it meant everything we had been taught was wrong. The symbolism of the American woman soldier extended beyond individual encounters. It represented, in concentrated form, all the ways that American democracy differed from Nazi totalitarianism. The flexibility versus rigidity, the pragmatism versus ideology, the expansion of opportunity versus the enforcement of hierarchy, the trust in individual capability versus the insistence on collective conformity. When a German woman saw an American woman in uniform, she was seeing not just an individual, but a system, a social, political, and economic system that had proven itself superior not through superior violence, but through superior organization, not through greater sacrifice, but through more effective mobilization of resources, not through ideological purity, but through practical inclusion. This symbolic power explains why the impact of these encounters extended far beyond the immediate moment. German women who met American servicewomen carried that experience with them into the post-war period. They became, in many cases, advocates for women's rights in the new German Federal Republic. They challenged the traditional gender norms that had been reinforced by Nazi ideology. They pushed for educational opportunities, professional advancement, legal equality. The psychological shock of encountering American servicewomen became, for many, a catalyst for personal and political transformation. They had seen an alternative model of womanhood, and they could not unsee it. The image of the American woman in uniform, confident, capable, recognized, respected remained with them, a reproach to the limitations imposed by German society, an aspirational vision of what women could be if given opportunity and recognition. The epilogue to this story extends across decades. In the 1950s and 1960s, as West Germany rebuilt and integrated into the Western Alliance, American military bases remained on German soil. German civilians, including many women, worked on those bases. They interacted daily with American servicewomen. They saw the continuation of a model that had first chucked them in 1945, women in uniform, women with authority, women whose military service was treated as normal rather than exceptional. These interactions, repeated millions of times across 20 years, helped reshape German attitudes toward gender roles. The influence was not unidirectional. American servicewomen abroad also faced traditionally gender expectations and sometimes adopted more conservative behaviors in response to local norms. But the overall effect was to establish an alternative model, to demonstrate that women could serve in military and professional roles without social collapse, to prove that gender equality and social stability were not mutually exclusive. By the time the Bundeswehr, the armed forces of the Federal Republic, began allowing women to serve in combat roles in 2001, the transformation was complete. German women now serve as pilots, infantry officers, submariners, roles that would have been unthinkable under the gender ideology of the Third Reich, roles that were pioneered by the American servicewomen who had shocked their grandmothers in 1945. The connection is not always acknowledged, but it is real. The tears that Margaret Hoffman shed in that cold room in Aachen in January 1945 were tears of ideological collapse, but they were also tears of recognition. Recognition that a different world was possible, that the boundaries she had been taught were natural and inevitable were in fact artificial and permeable, that women could be soldiers and citizens and individuals with agency rather than merely bearers of children and maintainers of homes. The historical lesson extends beyond gender to the nature of ideology itself. Totalitarian systems demand comprehensive belief. They insist that their vision of social organization is not just preferable but natural, not just policy but truth. They invest enormous energy in indoctrination, in creating closed systems of meaning that protect believers from contradictory evidence. But the vulnerability of such systems is precisely their rigidity. When contradictory evidence becomes unavoidable, when the lived reality demolishes the ideological claim, the entire structure can collapse with devastating speed. The German women who wept at the sight of American servicewomen were experiencing that collapse in real time. Everything they had been taught about gender, about society, about the natural order was being disproven by the simple fact of a woman in trousers with captain's bars on her shoulders. And because that one claim was so central to Nazi ideology, the idea that social hierarchy and traditional gender roles were natural and essential, its demolition called everything else into question. If they were wrong about women, what else were they wrong about? If American society had not collapsed despite granting women military status, what else had they been lied to about? The tears were not just about gender. They were about the comprehensive failure of an ideological system, about the painful realization that years of belief in service had been founded on lies. In the final accounting, the encounters between German female auxiliaries and American servicewomen were more than historical footnotes. They were moments of profound ideological confrontation, where theory met practice, where propaganda met reality, where the carefully constructed mythology of totalitarianism collided with the messy, pragmatic, but ultimately more humane reality of democracy. The American women who served in uniform during the Second World War were not fighting explicitly for women's rights. Most were motivated by patriotism, by desire to contribute to the war effort, by the same mix of idealism and pragmatism that motivated their male counterparts, but their service had revolutionary implications nonetheless. They proved that women could perform military functions, that gender was not destiny, that capability mattered more than biology. They demonstrated that a democratic society could wage total war while expanding rather than contracting individual freedoms, that pragmatic inclusion was more effective than ideological rigidity, that the supposed degeneracy of democracy was in fact its greatest strength. Its ability to draw on the talents and energies of all citizens regardless of their fit with ideological categories. The image of the American woman soldier, which produced such psychological shock in 1945, has now become normalized, integrated into the accepted range of women's roles, not just in America but throughout the democratic world. We take it for granted that women serve in military and professional capacities, that gender is not a barrier to citizenship or contribution, that traditional limitations were cultural artifacts rather than natural laws. But this acceptance was not inevitable. It was fought for, demonstrated, proven through the service of women like Captain Helen Brewster, Lieutenant Sarah Markowitz, Lieutenant Colonel Anna Wilson, and tens of thousands of others whose names are forgotten but whose impact remains. They wore their uniforms without apology. They performed their duties with competence. They represented a system that valued them as individuals and citizens rather than as mere embodiments of biological function. And in doing so, they became symbols of a larger truth: that freedom works, that democracy delivers, that a society organized around individual rights and opportunities rather than around rigid hierarchies and ideological purity will, in the end, prove stronger, more resilient, more capable of mobilizing its full potential than any totalitarian alternative. When Margaret Hoffmann wept in that cold room in Aachen, she was mourning more than Germany's defeat. She was mourning her own lost years, the sacrifice of her youth and energy to a lie. The realization that she could have been so much more if her society had valued her as an individual rather than as a function. But her tears were also a kind of liberation, the painful, necessary liberation that comes from seeing truth, from recognizing that the world is larger and more complex than ideology allows, from understanding that other ways of organizing society are not just possible, but demonstrably superior. In that sense, her tears were not just an ending, but the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward a more equal, more just, more human understanding of what women can be and do. The American women in uniform who provoked those tears could not have known the full significance of what they represented. They were simply doing their jobs, serving their country, wearing the uniform they had earned. But history, in its irony and complexity, made them symbols of something larger, ambassadors of a freer world, living proof that democracy's promise of equality was not just rhetoric, but could be made real, one uniform, one rank insignia, one professional woman at a time.